But what you want to understand about China is that it already controls a huge swath of territory on the Asian mainland. And we're not talking about China invading other countries on the Asian mainland. That's not the issue here. This is not like the Cold War where we worried about the Soviet Union attacking into Western Europe. China controls the Asian mainland. We're not threatening China on the Asian mainland. China, right, has interests in number one, the South China Sea, number two, Taiwan, and number three, the East China Sea. These are the three major flashpoints. And that's where we have to concentrate on containing China. We have to make sure that the Chinese don't invade Taiwan. We have to make sure that they don't dominate the South China Sea or the East China Sea.
Without further ado, let me welcome our guest today, Professor John Mearsheimer. Professor Mearsheimer is a realist theorist, which means he thinks the international system is dominated by great powers, and in their quest for security competition, sometimes we get war. Apart from theories, he has participated in policy debates. He was outspoken against the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, the US support of Israel, and the NATO provocation against Russia. Professor Mearsheimer, welcome to India and Global Left. What an honor to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's get started with China, because apparently what we are seeing with the tariff wars, the center of gravity of politics seems to have shifted to US-China relation. What are your thoughts about where this is heading towards?
Well, in the early 1990s, when China was still a developing country and was not a great power, the United States pursued a policy of engagement. And that policy was designed to make China a wealthy country and to integrate it into the international economy, to integrate it into international institutions. And the assumption was it would become a liberal democracy and we would all live happily ever after. I argued, and this was one of the central arguments in my book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, which was published in 2001, that China could not rise peacefully. And that, in fact, by turning China into a wealthy country, the United States was, in effect, turning China into a great power. And the more powerful China became, the more difficult it would be for the United States to deal with China. I believe that is what has happened. I believe in roughly 2017, China became a great power. And it's no accident that in 2017, after Trump moved into the White House the first time, that he abandoned engagement and adopted a policy of containment. Now, up until Trump's second term, that policy of containment against China involved, number one, putting together a military alliance structure in East Asia that could contain China, and number two, defeating China in the competition over developing high-end technologies. Those were the two dimensions of the competition between the United States and China up until the second Trump administration. And now Trump has added an important third dimension, which is the trade war. And it looks like this is effectively going to end almost all trade between the United States and China. And all of this tells you that the United States and China are engaged in an intense security competition where there is a serious possibility. And I want to underline that word possibility. I'm not saying this is axiomatically going to happen. There's a serious possibility of a great power war between China and the United States. So I would just say about the recent imposition of tariffs on China and China's imposition of tariffs on the United States in retaliation, that this is not terribly surprising, because as China got more and more powerful, it was, in my opinion, inevitable that the United States and China would be rivals.
I guess I want to take a step back here to ask you about your policy recommendation towards engaging in China? Because quite often there is one aspect of your writings that is just talking about the reality. But then there are also aspects where you advocate policies. We have seen it in Iraq, Israel, Russia, and so on. So do you personally believe that the United States should contain China? And if yes, then what should be those means and forms of containing China?
There's no question in my mind that the United States should contain China. My theory of international politics tells me that as China grows more powerful, the smart thing for China to do, is to dominate Asia, East Asia, the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. And the reason you want to do that, if you're China, is that's the best way to enhance your security. The more powerful you are in your own region, and of course, if you become a regional hegemon, you've reached the pinnacle of power in your region, then you maximize your security. The United States is a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. And if China is smart, it will try to become a regional hegemon in East Asia. However, this is not in America's national interest. The United States has a vested interest in making sure that China is not a regional hegemon. So the end result is that you will have a clash between China pursuing regional hegemony and the United States trying to prevent that. And the way for the United States to prevent it is to contain China. And I think it's essential to build an alliance structure in East Asia that can contain China. And furthermore, I do believe that the competition between the United States and China over cutting-edge technologies like AI, quantum computing, microchips, and so forth and so on, is a competition that the United States wants to win, and at least wants to make sure that China doesn't win. So I'm in favor of those two dimensions of the competition. I think they're inevitable. But I think that the trade war, certainly as Trump has designed it, is foolish.
I think let me pick up on that point of inevitability. I went through your book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. It's a good book. I really liked your analysis of the historical cases of French Napoleonic Wars, Germany, Imperial Japan, the Soviet Union. We can discuss. I would like to ask you a few questions there later. But based on that history, which is largely, as I see, is a history where empires used to be very central to geopolitics. You have theorized that the future would also mean that China's rise would be, China would have, let's say, an aggressive realism or an expansive thrust going forward. But my question is that there is a big assumption there, isn't it? Because we are living in the age of nation states where nationalism has risen massively, even in Asia. In fact, the alliance that you just mentioned about to begin with, a lot of countries are not friendly with China. And how does one imagine China being able to rise by doing what the United States did to Haiti, to Cuba, to Nicaragua, Honduras, or what the British Empire did to India or Germany did in the interwar periods? How strong is that argument?
I want to be clear that, first of all, my argument has nothing to do with colonial empires. Mm-hmm. Colonial empires are not important in my story. What matters are states, great powers in particular. This is a book that's entitled The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. So it's all about the relations between great powers. The second point is I agree with you completely about the importance of nationalism. I've long argued that it's the most powerful political ideology on the planet. And furthermore, when we talk about states today, we're not talking simply about states, we're talking about nation states. And the concept of a nation state is basically all about nationalism, nation state, right? The national state. So these are nation states. I would also add to this And this is one of the principal reasons I opposed the Iraq War. And that is that it is foolish in most cases to invade another country, because what will happen is you will run into a hornet's nest because of nationalism. That nation state that you invade will not want you threatening its sovereignty, and it will cause you all sorts of problems. So my view is you stay out of places like Afghanistan if you're smart. You stay out of places like Iraq. And when I was young, I learned this lesson during the Vietnam War. So I'm fully in agreement with you on the importance of nationalism. And again, it's embedded in the concept of a nation state. But what you want to understand about China is that it already controls a huge swath of territory on the Asian mainland. And we're not talking about China invading other countries on the Asian mainland. That's not the issue here. This is not like the Cold War, where we worried about the Soviet Union attacking into Western Europe. China controls the Asian mainland. We're not threatening China on the Asian mainland. China, right, has interests in, number one, the South China Sea, number two, Taiwan, and number three, the East China Sea. These are the three major flashpoints. And that's where we have to concentrate on containing China. We have to make sure that the Chinese don't invade Taiwan. We have to make sure that they don't dominate the South China Sea or the East China Sea.
I guess that's precisely where I would have taken this conversation into, because one side of your argument is based on theory, what has happened in the past. Of course, as you rightly pointed out, you don't word imperialism as a category of analysis, but nevertheless, I think the age of empire is worth mentioning in that analysis, precisely because we are living in an age of nationalism. But that apart, I think the theory apart, I think it is helpful to go through what are the emerging signals? And you've mentioned three: Taiwan, East China Sea, and South China Sea. Your critique would say that Taiwan is a completely special case. I mean, you know the history of China. I am a history student. It's a special case because both China and, it's hard to say now what the section of that in Taiwan, but there's definitely a lot of people in Taiwan still believes on the both sides of the Taiwanese Strait that they are part of one China. And so my question to you is that how correct is it that even if for a moment we assume that China would have an aggressive takeover of Taiwan, let's assume, I don't think it's right, but let's assume that's true. How much of that explains China's engagement with the rest of Asia?
Well, the point is that China has a vested interest in taking over Taiwan because it believes it's sacred Chinese territory and it belongs to China, right? But the important point here is that if China were to take Taiwan, it has all sorts of strategic implications for the balance of power in East Asia. If China were to dominate the South China Sea and the East China Sea the way it wants to, if it were to take Taiwan, if it were to push the Americans beyond the first island chain and then the second island chain and get them out of East Asia, this would have huge consequences on the balance of power in East Asia. And this would mean it would have consequences for the local states in the region. Countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, so forth and so on, and for India as well. So this is a very important issue, Taiwan, for geostrategic reasons as well as for nationalistic reasons.
So on the question of geostrategic, I mean, first of all, we should, everyone knows it, but I'd still like to rehash that. A lot of that geostrategy is there because of the massive presence of the United States. And then the question becomes, what is wrong, or what is the consequence that you perceive if the United States were to withdraw from, let's say, the South China Sea? Because a lot of a lot of those conflicts are border conflicts. A huge part of the conflict is, of course, geostrategic, who will dominate the region. But a lot of conflicts on the islands, about these dash lines and stuff, these are essentially border conflicts because there used to be empires, and when empires broke down, you mentioned India, the conflict between India and China is precisely something as a lot of us see as border conflicts rather than something that of nationalism, which we are now building up on from the Indian side. So my question to you is that a lot of people like us would see the volatility of this geopolitics emerging precisely from the presence of the United States in the first place.
If the United States was not in East Asia, it would make no difference for the India-China conflict in terms of
absolutely. That's
how
my
intense
question.
It is, right? There's no question about that. And the same is true with regard to Taiwan. If you took the United States away, the Taiwanese, and I'm disagreeing with you a bit here, the majority of Taiwanese, the overwhelming majority of Taiwanese do not want to be part of China.
Okay.
They've developed the Taiwanese identity.
There has been a
time.
history, yes.
So if you had a referendum, the Taiwanese would vote to remain independent and become a de jure nation state.
Rather than a loose integration.
Rather than a loose integration.
Okay.
The Taiwanese want to be a sovereign state. And the Chinese don't accept that. They believe that Taiwan is part of China. It is sacred territory. So you have this fundamental disagreement there. And that's independent of the United States. And you certainly know that the Japanese and the Chinese have a rich history of fighting wars and of hating each other. All you have to do is go back really to 1931 when the Japanese took Manchuria, and then 1937 when full-scale war broke out between Japan and China that lasted until 1945 to recognize that the potential for conflict between Japan and China is ever present, whether the United States is located in the region or not. The point about the United States is that it's probably necessary to have the United States in East Asia for purposes of containing China. If the United States was not there, I don't think the Japanese and the other countries in East Asia could do it themselves.
Help me get through a few sequence of arguments here, because initially we said that based on your framework of realist analysis, that it is important to contain China from the United States perspective because the rise of China would be detrimental to, I assume, not just cutting back United States power, but also to a lot of others. Is that correct? Is that assumption? Okay, if that is correct, and then on the follow-up answer, you said that if it was not for the United States, granted the problem of Taiwan is a special case, as I admit. There are cases of that in all post-colonial nation states where nationalisms went in different directions. Let's not discuss about Taiwan for a moment. But in terms of other nations, let's say about peaceful coexistence of Japan and China, what makes us believe that that's not possible without the United States?
The East China Sea.
But that's United States.
No, that's on the contrary, it's the Japanese and the Chinese. There are a handful of rocks, small islands in the East China Sea that are bitterly, I'm choosing my words carefully here, they're bitterly disputed by Japan and by China.
But do you really believe that those border conflicts, which I would define as border conflicts, would really threaten would these border conflicts necessarily take the two nations into war in today's day and age?
Yes, there is a serious possibility that if the United States wasn't there, and even with the United States there, that Japan and China could get into a fight over what the Japanese call the Senkaku Islands and the Chinese call the Diao Islands. No, you do not want to underestimate the potential for trouble.
And
here.
you believe those conflicts would have been there even without the United States? Because earlier you said that a lot of these conflicts are because of the polarization in geopolitics. For instance, the AUKUS, for instance, this sort of massive encircling of China, including United States way down into Australia.
Let me ask you a question. Do you think if the United States was not in Asia at all, that there would still be a conflict over the border between China and India?
Nation states would have had conflicts about border states. About India and China, definitely there are 4,000. But let me qualify. No, the qualification is important, because if not for the United States, the conflicts would have been treated as border conflicts. And as you know, that China has already resolved peacefully about 10 border conflicts out of 14.
It's irrelevant. There is an intense border conflict between China and India.
Yeah, but
and
wouldn't you make
you that I think it has nothing to do with the United States. And you could take the United States away and you'd still have that border conflict.
The border conflict has nothing to do with the United States. I agree. It was because there were two empires which broke down, and out of that nation states emerged.
But it's not the United
States. But the polarization. No, what I'm saying is that the larger polarization of Quad, of AUKUS, using different bases in the Indian Ocean, that is precisely because there is the presence of the United States. Indians wouldn't have dared going, even talking about encircling China without the United States.
That's a different issue. The point that we were debating to begin with was whether or not the Japanese and the Chinese would be at loggerheads over the East China Sea, and in particular over those tiny islands, right? That was the question. And you said that if the United States was taken away, right, then the conflict would basically disappear.
No, I didn't say that.
No, you didn't say that.
I said if the United States were not there, especially in the East China Sea and South China Sea, then the conflicts would have been lower intensity and limited to border conflicts, which we have seen in the case of Central Asia, for instance. There were a lot of border conflicts, quote unquote, with China and a lot of former Soviet Union Central Asian states. A lot of them have been much more peacefully resolved because they were treated as border conflicts.
You haven't been able to peacefully resolve the Indian border conflict with China. You haven't been able to peacefully resolve the conflict over those islands. This is basically a zero-sum game.
Yeah, but what I'm asking, Professor, is that the polarization makes it worse. So, for example, in the precise case of India and China, if you look at the years before 2014, and it massively escalated since 2017 or 18 when Chinese and Indian soldiers, came to blows in the Himalayas, during the interim period, before that, there was a much sanguine and much, less nationalistic limping forward towards the resolution of the conflict.
You know why that's the case? Because China was not a great power. What's happened here is China turned into a great power. And when it became a great power, it became more aggressive. And the more powerful China becomes, the more likely it is that it's going to try and shove a border settlement down India's throat. That's the way great power politics works.
So then,
this is why I said it was not in India's interest, it was not in Taiwan's interest to turn China into a great power. I remember when I went to Taiwan in 2014, I had a one-on-one conversation with the president of Taiwan, President Ma. And President Ma was very interested in interacting with China and helping the Chinese economy to grow. I told him this was a major mistake. You're going to turn China into a great power, and China has its gun sights on Taiwan.
Also, a lot of Taiwanese businesses were contingent on China's rise.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. And he said that was a good thing. And I said, from a geopolitical point of view, that does not make sense. But this is exactly what happened with India. The problem that India faces now, and I've talked to a number of Indians who recognize this, is that China is getting more and more powerful. And in fact, one could argue the gap between India and China is widening. And this is bad news for India, because great powers tend to try to settle things with coercive threats or sometimes with military force when they get to be really powerful.
I guess here we read the situation a little bit differently. I mean, I think the escalation happened precisely because the Hindu nationalists came to power, which meant a much more aggressive form of nationalism in India, and on the other side with the Pakistan, because also the gap between India and Pakistan has increased. And now that you have disempowered the Muslims in India, you need a bigger piece for the Hindu nationalists to galvanize your nationalism. But that's an internal view of how I look at the situation.
You're switching the focus to the India-Pakistan conflict. We're talking about the India.
No, I'm saying that's important if you take an internal view, as I do. My internal view is that the escalation since 2017 doesn't reflect an escalation of asymmetry, as you said, but more than that, a change in internal domestic policy of India, which make nationalism the central piece.
That may be true. But we weren't talking about that.
Of course,
we were talking about India and China.
Yeah, no, because your explanation was that India-China conflict has escalated precisely because the gap has increased. In fact, if anything, I look at what my field is economics, I would say economically speaking, not in terms of specific technology, not in terms of military, but economically speaking, I think we have seen the peak of asymmetry between China and India. India is most likely to grow at a much faster pace. I'm not getting into the nature of growth and all of that.
All I will say is I hope you're right.
So then I think a good pause here, and that would probably help us segue into Russia and Ukraine and others, where I think we agree. I mean, I think this is the only case that we disagreed on, and I think like in diplomacy, people say begin with something that people agree on and then move into disagreements. But I think in marketing, it is said that show the most interesting things to the customer at the beginning, and so I think that's where I started.
Up until about 2017, but that world has gone away. And East Asia is just much more important to us today than Europe is.
In terms of Chinese nationalism, there is this idea that, at least I do more economics and economic history, so it's much stronger there, that Chinese nationalism for a very long time, at least since the 80s, at least since the end of Cultural Revolution, has a very significant economic component to it, by which we mean that development is a very, very important focus. And I can go through all the 90s and 2000s. I don't think I should now. That more than ideology, more than everything else, development has been the focus because that has kept the legitimacy of the party in place. And there is a lot more to be done because, for one thing, if not anything else, development hasn't been even in China. The difference between the western provinces and the eastern coast is roughly 2 to 3 times in terms of GDP per capita. There are also larger problems with the Chinese economy that are emerging. And so some people argue, those of us who at least look at China internally and focus on economics, is that there is a sense of economism within Chinese nationalism that keeps it away from the kind of American nationalism or European nationalism, all of which which comes in indirectly in the case studies that you did. Do you find any substance in that regard, in this line of argument?
I think nationalism is a generic concept that applies to China, the United States, Russia, Germany, Vietnam, in the same way. I mean, there's some minor differences on the margin, but the generic concept fits in all of these cases. And China, of course, is a remarkably nationalistic country. But let me just say a few more words about that. You emphasize, I think quite correctly, that the elites in China want to develop the country. They want to pursue a development strategy that works because that helps keep them in power.
Yeah.
Gives them legitimacy.
It's very different from the United States, where you can come and just roll out a bunch of tariffs without caring anything for the capital markets. I mean, we haven't seen that kind of.
I don't think you want to generalize to the United States based on what President Trump recently did.
Okay. Yeah. No, fair point. Yeah.
But American elites, by and large, care about development. They care about generating prosperity.
They do, and the markets have pushed back Trump, even Trump.
Of course, but the point is because they want to stay in power. So I'm agreeing with you. But you do not want to underestimate that there are two other reasons that leaders are interested in development. One, and it's the most important, is that prosperity translates into military might. And military might is important because if you're interested in surviving in a brutal international system, you want to be powerful. So you want to develop, right, economically, so you can translate economic might into military might and you enhance your prospects of survival. You want to remember that when China was weak, you had the century of national humiliation.
Of course.
The causes of the century of national humiliation, the cause was Chinese weakness. And the problem is that they were economically backward compared to the developing West. So there's that security rationale as well as the domestic political rationale. But the other reason is that if you're the leader of a country, you just have a vested interest. Forget the politics in making sure that your people are prosperous. They're your people. You want them to lead a nice life, or at least a decent life.
Right.
So I think if you're a Chinese leader, you're worried about your political position. You're worried about the welfare of your body politic, and you're worried about the security of your body politic or your nation state. And all of those motives push you to work very hard to develop your economy. And, we were talking before about cutting edge technologies. If you're the Chinese, you have a deep-seated interest in being on the cutting edge of all these new technologies that are out there, as do the Americans. If you're Indian, you have a deep-seated interest in getting out there with the Americans and with the Chinese. I often see all these Indian scientists and engineers who are coming to Silicon Valley. I would think from India's point of view, they ought to create their own Silicon Valley and keep those scientists and engineers there. Why? Because if you're on the cutting edge of the world's leading technologies, that generates wealth, which means it generates prosperity. It's good for the body politic. It's good for the people of India or China or the United States. So I would just add to what you said by bringing in those other dimensions.
Professor Mearsheimer, it has been an incredible honor to have you on, and thank you so much for your time.
You're more than welcome, Mike.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it thoroughly.
大家好，欢迎来到烽火的频道。本期视频分享的是2025年的4月15日，约翰·米尔斯海默与印度博主的一场对话节目。他呀是一名犹太人，可能很多人想不到他还是北京外国语大学的荣誉教授，中国人民大学的名誉教授。米尔斯海默以进攻性现实主义理论闻名，也是全球中国威胁论的理论倡导者。对于中国的有关言论当然不会太友好，带有极强的意识形态偏见。节目当中他表示是美国把中国培养成一个强国，并毫不掩饰的表达美国要遏制中国的企图。同时他还表示在 AI 芯片等领域的竞争，美国是势在必胜。他的言论放在至今也是见怪不怪了。在这里烽火来点评两句。首先中国成为强国是因为中国人民的艰苦奋斗，无数人前仆后继的牺牲，才有了今天的成就，不是美国来培养的，也不是美国说遏制就能遏制成功的。其次，中国人民和政府对美国要遏制中国早就有了充分的认知，绝对不会因为认知不到位或侥幸心理对美国放松警惕。至于 AI 以及芯片战，不是已经在打了吗？结果怎么样？美国并没有压倒性的优势可以把中国按在地上摩擦。随着中国被迫对稀土进行管控， 中美的 AI 和芯片竞争变成了美国突破稀土提炼和中国突破芯片技术的竞争，谁先突破，鹿死谁手还犹未可知。从目前的情势来看，似乎美国突破稀土花费的时间呢将更加的长远。所以烽火不知道米尔斯海默哪里来的信心说美国是势在必胜。关于台湾问题，米尔斯海默更是在胡扯了，不敢真正的面对现实。以如今的中国实力，烽火再次断定美国是绝对不敢军事介入台湾统一。美国一旦，那就是美国将永远沦为世界二流国家，美国在全球的利益都将不复存在。很明显这不会是美国想要的结果，也不符合美国的利益。台湾只是一个棋子而已，榨干最后一点价值就抛弃了。这点地缘政治账还算不清楚吗？乌克兰的前车之鉴就摆在眼前。还好这位印度小哥非常的睿智，没有听米尔斯海默的一味的瞎吹。好了，本期视频就分享到这里，我们下期再见。